Thanks to everyone for being here and for Andrea and Melissa for organizing this wonderful event. My name is Taylor Fravel. I joined the department in the fall of 2004, and I'm still thrilled to be here. In fact, when I was on the job market, I got the news from MIT through a phone call from Josh Cohen that I'd been offered a position. And although I'm trained in political science and I think about strategy, I did the most unstrategic thing possible. I told all the other schools I was considering that I was no longer interested in coming out for an interview because I was going to be going to MIT. That's how excited I was to have the opportunity to come here, and that's why I'm still thrilled to be here today as a member of the faculty. My work focuses on trying to explain when, why, and how China adopts the national and foreign security policies that it does. When I was doing this, it was not in vogue, and in fact, when MIT hired me, it was not terribly in vogue. I recall being in graduate school, I started graduate school fall of '98. When September 11th rolled around, one of my friends asked me, now that terrorism has become the big pressing national security issue of the day, what are you going to do? I said, I'm not worried. China has always been an important challenge for the United States and will continue to be one, and I think I certainly was justified in that assessment. MIT is a terrific place to be for a scholar like myself who is very problem-driven, and the problem here, again, is trying to understand the policies that China has pursued and then what the implications of these policies are for peace and stability in the region and ultimately for U.S. policy towards China more generally. What I wanted to do is briefly talk about some of my most recent research in the area of China's nuclear strategy. This builds upon two papers, one that I published several years ago and one that is forthcoming, as Vipin mentioned, that I'm particularly proud about because it was in collaboration with one of our graduate students. I think that reflects sort of the non-hierarchical sort of culture we have here at MIT. So in the first paper, I found that China sort of avoided sort of the trap of the United States and the Soviet Union of sort of building up a large nuclear force during the Cold War. Instead, it pursued what I described as a strategy of assured retaliation, which had two key components. The first was a no first use policy, that China would not be the state to use nuclear weapons first, which meant that it would have a second strike posture. It only used nuclear weapons after it had been attacked. And the main purpose, of course, was to deter a country from attacking it in the first place. And then it did not need a large nuclear arsenal for its purpose. It only needed to have enough weapons to be able to survive that first strike and then inflict some unacceptable retaliation on an adversary. And this has characterized China's approach to nuclear weapons for decades, which is what makes it interesting. Why for decades? Because it was associated with the ideas of the two most important leaders in China, both militarily and politically, Mao Zedong and Deng Xiaoping. They dictated that this is what China's approach to nuclear weapons would be, and given the centralized nature of the Chinese political system and the fact that the People's Liberation Army is a party army that pays very close attention to the directives of the party, they were able to maintain this approach. So fast forward to sort of the mid-2000s, China had a relatively small arsenal of nuclear weapons. And this no first use policy, and very much positioned to pursue, to strike second, but not to strike first. And this was sort of deemed to be quite stabilizing. The question, which motivates the paper that I've done with Fiona Cunningham, the graduate student on this project, is will this change, right? This could change for two important reasons. The first is that China is just a lot wealthier than it was before. And so maybe it didn't build a large arsenal of nuclear weapons before, not because it had it was wise, but simply because it couldn't afford to do so. China now is the world's second largest economy, certainly has the means to build a much larger nuclear force if it wanted to do so. But the second reason has to do with US policy and has to do with what Barry talked about in the previous panel. The US is developing new capabilities in the strategic domain that actually pose a threat to China's deterrent. This includes a robust missile defense system, as well as conventional long-range precision strike systems. Missile defenses, you might say this is purely a defensive capability designed to protect the United States from rogue attacks, but if you're a country like China with a small nuclear arsenal, you might actually view this as a threat to your deterrent, and in fact, quite offensive. So it reflects the dynamic of the security dilemma that was talked about. So the question we wanted to pose was, the question that we asked was, is this going to change? Our method was highly sophisticated. We decided to read what the Chinese wrote about nuclear weapons and then to go talk to the Chinese about how they think about nuclear weapons, which actually you can do in China, right? It's not this completely untransparent state. I sort of quip with my friends in Washington who talk about China's lack of transparency, and I say, well, yeah, it is kind of not that transparent in English, but if you read Chinese, it's quite transparent. So everyone go read Chinese, right? Learn Chinese and figure it out. And so we were able to identify all sorts of new sources on that sort of previous scholars hadn't used to better understand how China thinks about nuclear weapons, including a journal from one of their main military think tanks, and we sort of, to use Rich's term, we vacuumed up all this information, although it was not that much, but it was still a lot, and then we processed it. This produced three main findings that I wanted to share with you today. The first is that China does believe it is threatened by missile defense and conventional long-range strike. So you could think about it conceptually or theoretically that this might be the case, and in fact it is true, and especially missile defense. China currently has around 85 warheads that could strike the United States, the continental United States. It's not a large number, and one could project out in the future that missile defenses would basically be able to prevent China from threatening that retaliatory strike, which it believes actually is stabilizing and achieves deterrence. So China does view the future nuclear landscape as threatening, as much more ominous than before. That's the first finding. The second finding is that China's not going to abandon its nuclear strategy for something that would approximate a first strike approach, a more offensive approach, or even a limited warfighting strategy. That's the big concern, right? That China's had this relatively moderate approach to nuclear weapons, and that they might change this. It's going to actually keep the existing strategy, but tweak it in two ways. First, unsurprisingly, it's going to build more weapons that can strike the United States. Not a lot, but enough to just overwhelm whatever missile defenses might be able to catch. So China wants just to have enough that it can't be threatened by that capability. And secondly, in terms of the U.S. conventional long-range strike capabilities, China is now allowing limited ambiguity over no first use under a particular set of circumstances, primarily if the United States were to decide that somehow it might want to use these conventional weapons to attack China's nuclear forces or its associated infrastructure. This poses a real challenge for a problem because it wouldn't be a nuclear first strike on China by the United States, but it would have the effect of degrading China's nuclear forces. So China's now allowing a little bit of ambiguity about no first use under those conditions. Now you might say, and this gets to my third finding, that this is going to increase crisis instability because now China is suggesting that no first use no longer holds, or that if it engages in limited signaling over this one particular problem, it's going to have much broader implications and the U.S. might miscalculate. At the same time, though, I think perhaps because of this long tradition of viewing the utility of nuclear weapons in very narrow terms for only deterring nuclear attacks against China, China's relatively optimistic about avoiding the use of nuclear weapons in a crisis with the United States. It first doesn't think the stakes in these crises would warrant the use of nuclear weapons, and they're probably right on that score. And they've sort of set up their forces in a way where the nuclear forces and the conventional forces, although they share some command and control infrastructure, they're not co-located in a way that if you were attacking a conventional ballistic missile in China, you might inadvertently attack a nuclear one and thus warrant a response from China. So those are the three main findings that come out of this research, but it also raises an important question that we discuss in the paper, which is that this could backfire for two reasons, right? By creating some kind of ambiguity over no first use, even if it's limited to a very particular set of circumstances, it could have two unintended consequences. And we're not sure which way it would go, but both are not positive. One would be that the U.S. just views it as a bluff, right? And so it might end up threatening things that China believes to be strategic in nature, including some of China's nuclear forces. That's bad. Or what it could do is energize the U.S. to invest even more in missile defenses and other capabilities that would prevent China from retaliating against it, because it believes that because China has allowed some ambiguity in terms of no first use, it might allow much more ambiguity in the future. We don't find any evidence for that in the materials that we've examined and the individuals that we've spoken to, but it's certainly a concern that you would have once you move from a very strict no first use policy to something that is slightly less, even if it's just slightly less. So to wrap up, I think This particular paper represents the kind of work that is being done today at MIT in terms of security studies and in terms of the study of China. And in this way, as I said before, I'm very proud to be associated with a department which does have a very long history in the study of China, starting, of course, with Lucian Pai, also Susan Shirk, who's here with us today, and many other distinguished graduates. So thank you very much.